The silence comes first, a stillness so complete it feels as though the very stars are holding their breath. Then comes the voice over the vox, not of warning, not of mercy, but of judgment. When the High Lords of Terra decree Exterminatus, no prayer, no fortress, no army can halt the doom descending from the void. Entire continents vanish beneath firestorms hotter than suns. Oceans boil, skies ignite, and cities crumble into dust. For those trapped below, there is no escape, no survival, only the slow unraveling of everything they have ever known. Exterminatus is not merely death, it is erasure. The deliberate unmaking of a world and every memory it ever held. Before we descend into the burning heart of this story, if you find yourself drawn into the shadows of Warhammer 40K, into the forgotten corners of lore and the terrible fates of those who dwell there, then join us, subscribe, share, and keep walking with us through the darkest places of the Imperium, for what follows will not only chill the imagination, but bind you closer to the grim truth of this universe. Asterisk. The morning air was heavy with a stillness that unsettled even the most hardened workers of the hive. Smoke no longer rose in steady plumes from the manufactorums, and the rhythmic grind of servitors along the assembly lines faltered into uneasy silence. For a world that lived and died by routine, where the hum of machinery was as natural as the beating of one's own heart, the absence of sound was the first true omen. Men and women glanced upward without meaning to, eyes searching the heavens through dust-choked skylights, and though they saw nothing but cloud, a tremor of unease began to thread itself through every street, every hablock, every corridor at first. The rumors whispered like static across the Vox. An astropath in the capital had screamed herself blind, clawing at her own face before collapsing into silence. The governor's retinue had pulled her away, but word spread faster than authority could choke it. Across the city, factory overseers barked at laborers to return to their stations, but even they could not disguise their own stolen glances skyward, their nervous fingers tapping against data. Something was coming, though no one dared speak its name aloud. In the underhives, the unease curdled into dread. There, beneath layers of rusted steel and dripping pipes, the air vibrated with stories told in broken voices, that a great shadow had fallen across the system, that ships of the Imperium had gathered not to protect, but to judge. Whole families clutched one another in the dark, waiting for the sound of boots upon the stairwells, for the roar of engines that might tear apart the only walls they had ever known. Children pressed hands over their ears to block out the rising wails of the hab preacher, who howled about fire descending from the sky, about sin demanding payment. Yet, in the governor's palace, the air was different. There, the silence was cultivated, heavy with ritual and formality. A message had been received, its words cold and simple, sealed with the double-headed Aquila. It was not a warning, it was not a threat, it was a decree. The planetary governor had collapsed into his throne, unable to read it twice, the words bleeding together into a shape he could not bear to comprehend. His aides begged him to act, to open channels, to send apologies or explanations, but he could do nothing. Exterminatus was not a sentence to be appealed. It was a commandment from the Imperium itself, and to resist was to compound the sin for which his world was already marked. Still, the people did not know. In the marketplaces, merchants barked their final bargains, voices strained and hollow as though they too feared being silenced. Soldiers of the Astra Militarum drilled in formation, boots striking cracked stone, though their officers' eyes betrayed the hollowness of the exercise. What use was discipline when the enemy could not be seen, when no invasion fleet darkened the horizon? Even the ecclesiarchy faltered, their sermons wavering between promises of deliverance and sudden, panicked calls for repentance. As the day waned, the sky itself began to betray them. A faint shimmer crept across the firmament, subtle at first, like heat rippling across desert sands. Few noticed, and fewer still wished to acknowledge it. but those who did felt their stomachs lurch, as though the very heavens were bending under unseen weight. It was the first sign of the fleets above, distant and silent, their weapons aligning, their targeting cogitators whispering death in binary hymns. Children pointed at the shimmer and laughed nervously, calling it a trick of the light. Parents hushed them, gripping their shoulders too tightly, their own eyes wide with the kind of recognition that comes from instinct rather than knowledge. Something vast was preparing, something that dwarfed every fortress, every cathedral, every soul on the planet. And in that widening silence, the people felt it. The last dawn had already begun. The sun dipped lower, and with it came a strange pall over the city. Light no longer scattered the way it once had. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching over spires and hablocks like grasping fingers. People found themselves staring upward more often than not, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was staring back from beyond the sky. The few who dared speak aloud muttered about the fleets that must be out there, hidden behind orbiting moons or cloaked by void silence, their gun decks yawning wide with patient malice in the barracks of the Astra Militarum. Fear was a poison that discipline could not purge. The conscripts had trained for invasion, for the clash of las guns against bolters, for the desperate stand upon ramparts against orc hordes or tyrannid swarms. But how could one brace against the void itself? The youngest recruits whispered, in their bunks of worlds they had heard of, planets purged from history, where no one was spared, where even the soil was scorched until it remembered nothing. Their officers shouted them down, ordering silence, but the veterans' eyes betrayed the truth. They too had heard those stories. Some had even watched distant flames consume entire continents from the viewing ports of troop transports. They knew the shape of what was coming, and they knew no gun, no wall, no prayer would hold it back. In the lower levels of the hive, desperation was already breaking the thin crust of order. Gangs roved through the tunnels, seizing water still sloshing in rusted containers, breaking into storerooms where nutrient paste was hoarded by the ecclesiarch. Priests struck them down in the emperor's name, their voices raw with fury. But for every body that fell, another dozen appeared, mouths foaming with hunger and panic. Mothers fought with nails and teeth for scraps to feed their children, while men who had never raised a blade in their lives carried makeshift cudgels of pipe and wire, ready to kill for one last meal. And above them, in the cathedral that crowned the city, the high priest raised his arms before the cracked altar and screamed into the incense-choked air. He spoke of purification, of the emperor's mercy delivered in fire. His words echoed from the stone like thunder, but they brought no comfort. They were promises of release, dressed in terror. Some knelt in rapture, their foreheads pressed to the floor, as if submission might spare them. Others fled the cathedral weeping, unable to accept that their lives, their families, their histories, would be nothing more than ash scattered on a wind that would never remember their names. In the countryside, far from the hive spires, farmers and field workers gazed at the horizon and saw dust plumes rising where no storm should be. Their augurs and data slates screamed errors, displaying signals so corrupted they might as well have been curses. Herds of groks bolted blindly into the wilderness, as if the beasts themselves knew what their masters dared not admit. Old men who had lived their lives by the cycles of harvest now sat silent on porches, staring at the sky with hollow eyes, their lips forming prayers that sounded less like devotion and more like surrender. Yet even in the capital, denial fought with despair. Voxcasters still played music in some squares, though the notes were warped and tinny, as if the machines themselves resisted singing. Merchants hawked wares at reduced prices, shouting into the heavy air, trying to convince themselves that coins still mattered. Lovers clung together in alleys, swearing eternal bonds that would not survive the night. Children begged for sweets from vendors, who gave them away freely, because what use was rationing when there would be no tomorrow? And always, the shimmer grew stronger. By dusk, it was no longer a trick of the eye. It pulsed faintly, a veil stretched thin over the heavens, visible even to those who prayed not to see it. Some collapsed where they stood, racked by visions they could not explain. Others screamed at their neighbors, accusing them of sin, demanding confessions, as though enough spilled secrets might turn the fleet aside. But the sky offered no answers. It only glowed with the faint, dreadful promise of what was to come. In the governor's palace, the last messages were sent. Please, screamed into the void, begging for reprieve, for reconsideration, for mercy. None were answered. The silence of the Imperium was more terrible than any curse, for in that silence was certainty, the knowledge that the world had already been condemned, and that its final dawn had passed unnoticed. Night fell, but it was no true darkness. The heavens glowed faintly, a sickly illumination that painted the clouds with hues of green and gold, as though the very atmosphere had begun to burn. The people of the hive stared upward with hollow eyes, unable to look away, trapped in the certainty that what they witnessed was not natural, not celestial, but mechanical, somewhere beyond their vision. Vast engines aligned in cyclopean torpedo tubes whispered liturgies in machine voice. Readying payloads of utter annihilation, sleep became impossible. In hablocks and manufactorum dormitories, families gathered together in uneasy silence, unwilling to speak the fears that gnawed at them. Some whispered prayers, their lips cracked from the dryness in the air, for even the moisture seemed to be leaching away, as if the world itself recoiled. Others stared into flickering lumen strips, waiting for them to die and plunge their lives into the dark they feared would never end. The first signs of collapse arrived with the dawn sirens. There were not alarms of war, not the blaring klaxons that heralded invasion, but keening wails from Vox towers as their signals fractured under the unseen weight pressing from orbit. Communication arrays sparked and burned, showering courtyards with molten debris. Entire sectors of the hive went silent in a heartbeat, their Vox relays reduced to shrieking static. Without orders, regiments faltered. Without orders, civilians panicked. By mid-morning, the streets were chaos. Thousands surged through the avenues, driven by blind instinct to flee somewhere, anywhere. Mothers carried their children until their arms failed, then dragged them through the mud and ash. Men brawled in the open for stolen ration tins, teeth breaking against knuckles slick with blood. Soldiers attempted to form cordons, but when the crowd surged, discipline shattered. Less fire split the air, not at enemies, but at fellow citizens. Bodies dropped, and the mob howled louder. The governor's palace locked its gates, and still they came. Desperate masses pressed against the adamantium doors, their fists pounding, their voices breaking in a chorus of pleas and curses. Guards fired warning shots, but when the people refused to retreat, the guns turned downward. Dozens fell. Still they surged. The doors held, but the air was filled with the stench of blood and smoke. The last fragments of loyalty had died there, trampled under the boots of a crowd that knew their ruler had already abandoned them. In the manufactorums, machines groaned and died as power lines overloaded. Sparks rained from ceilings, igniting oils that burned unchecked, consuming workers in sheets of blue flame. The screams echoed down endless corridors, carrying far beyond the walls, until they sounded like the death cries of the hive itself. In the underhive, gangs rose fully into open war, carving out territories they knew they would never hold. Violence was no longer for survival, but for meaning. A final act of defiance against the inevitability pressing from the skies. And then came the visions. Astropaths and psychers shrieked in their cells, clawing their eyes from their sockets, bleeding from ears and mouths. The veil between worlds trembled under the weight of approaching fire. In their screams, the people heard fragments of the truth, that no plea would save them, that no emperor's mercy would descend, that their world's name had already been struck from the records of Terra. Priests tried to drown the voices with louder chants, raising their censers high. But faith rang hollow when the words themselves melted into panic. By the second night, there was no order left. The hive burned from within, not from bombs, but from its own despair. The air was thick with ash, both from fires and from the countless bodies thrown onto pyres by those who refused to leave their dead unburied. Even in the end, the shimmer in the sky no longer flickered faintly. It burned bright and undeniable now. A curtain of light stretched across the firmament, as if the heavens themselves had split open to reveal the gaping maw of the fleet. And then, in that silence heavy as stone, the people finally understood. This was not invasion. This was not war. This was sentence. Their final dawn had passed, and all that remained was to wait for the fire. The sky broke without warning. One moment, the heavens were an endless veil of trembling light, shimmering with the faint distortions of distant voidcraft. The next, the air itself convulsed. A thunderclap so vast it rattled stone foundations and shattered glass across entire districts. Those who looked up saw nothing at first, only a sudden line of brilliance, a streak of fire cutting through the night, as if some cruel god had drawn a blade across the firmament. Then the streak multiplied, tenfold, 100-fold, until the sky itself became a rain of falling suns. The first impact erased half a district in silence. The explosion came a heartbeat later, a wall of sound so vast that lungs collapsed and eardrums ruptured. Stone towers folded like paper, manufactorums crumbled, and the very ground heaved upward before collapsing inward in a roar that swallowed every cry. Those who had survived the panic of the days before now found themselves stumbling in blind terror, their bodies pelted with molten debris, their breath stolen by choking clouds of ash. Firestorms swept outward from each crater, driven by winds so fierce that men and women were torn from their feet and hurled against walls with bone-shattering force. Whole avenues vanished beneath surges of burning air. Windows melted into liquid rivulets, dripping down the sides of hablocks before solidifying into black scars. Every surface glowed with heat, every breath seared the throat. People tried to run, but there was no direction safe to flee. Behind them, fire roared higher. Before them, fire fell from the sky. Above, unseen by those trapped below, the fleets moved with the calm precision of ritual. Lance batteries flared, each beam a lance of pure annihilation cutting down through atmosphere and stone. Torpedoes screamed from tubes larger than cathedrals, their warheads carrying the Emperor's judgment in concentrated payloads of fusion and viral agents. Crewmen chanted prayers as they turned keys, as if their voices could sanctify the slaughter. To them it was duty. To the world below it was damnation. In the streets, the Astra Militarum broke. No order could hold against the rain of fire. Platoons scattered, discipline dissolving as men threw down las guns and tried to shield their families. Officers shouted until their throats tore, but even they faltered as orbital fire swallowed whole regiments in seconds. Vox channels dissolved into static, or worse, into the screams of commanders cut off mid-sentence. Entire companies were lost, their names unrecorded, their banners consumed by flame before they could fall. The civilians suffered worse still. Thousands were crushed beneath collapsing hablocks, their cries lost beneath the grinding collapse of ferrocrete. Others suffocated as the atmosphere itself turned against them. Thick with toxic fumes belched from ruptured reactors and burning fuel lines. Children clung to parents already dying, their small hands pressed against skin blistering from the heat. The old and infirm lay where they fell, bodies trembling as if the earth itself were shuddering beneath them. And yet, amid the devastation, silence returned. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of awe, of shock, so profound it hollowed the chest. For when the first wave passed, when the earth stopped shaking and the roar of flame dimmed, those who still lived emerged from the ruins and saw the scars carved into their world. Entire sectors were gone. Streets that once bustled with life were now plains of glass and ash. Towers that had stood for centuries had been flattened into rubble, their outlines still glowing faintly, as if ashamed to remain standing. The survivors did not cheer for having lived. They did not call for help. They simply stared, hollow-eyed at the void above, and understood that this was only the beginning. The weight of silence pressed down, heavier than the bombs themselves, because every soul who still drew breath knew that the fleet would strike again and again, until nothing remained. The second wave fell heavier than the first. This time the fleet did not strike in scattered lines, but in unison, a symphony of annihilation, conducted with terrible precision. Orbital lances tore through the clouds like pillars of lightning, cutting clean through hive towers until their spires folded inward in blazing collapse. Torpedoes descended in clusters, detonating with such force that entire districts disintegrated before sound could even carry. Whole swaths of the planet's crust split open, vomiting fire and molten stone into the air, as if the world itself were screaming in agony. No one mistook it for war anymore. War implied struggle, a clash of forces, some exchange of violence that carried the faintest possibility of survival. This was execution. The ground itself rebelled beneath the weight of impact. Streets rippled like waves, ferrocrete buckling as if it were soft clay. Bridges snapped and tumbled into chasms. In some places, the bombardments struck deep enough to ignite underground reservoirs of promethium, sending geysers of flame roaring hundreds of meters into the sky, consuming entire battalions and every soul too slow to flee. The atmosphere, once the shield of all life, now became the weapon. The force of each strike sucked oxygen into rolling firestorms that devoured everything in their path. Whirlwinds of ash and cinders twisted through avenues, picking up bodies and hurling them like dolls into walls that shattered bone on impact. Clouds boiled into black thunderheads, pierced by forks of lightning that licked the ruins, as though the heavens themselves rejoiced in the destruction. Rain fell, but it was not water. It was molten metal and chemical ash, burning holes through flesh, searing lungs until every cough came out black. The Astra Militarum ceased to exist as a coherent force. Vox signals, already fractured, vanished altogether. Commanders, who had sworn to die at their posts, found themselves dragged screaming into the stampede of civilians, indistinguishable now from the masses they once ruled. A handful still fired into the sky, lasguns barking uselessly at the void, their discipline breaking into madness. Others turned their weapons inward, unable to face what loomed above, choosing a swift end over the slow fire raining down in the cathedrals. Faith burned with the same violence as stone. Priests still raised their censers, swinging them high over the crowds gathered in blind desperation, but their chants turned hoarse, their voices drowned by the roar of collapsing ceilings. When the lances cut through stained glass windows, shattering images of saints and martyrs, entire congregations were consumed in blasts of sacred fire and molten iconography. Yet the liturgies did not cease. Even as their bodies blistered and their eyes melted, some cried louder, declaring that the flames themselves were the Emperor's embrace. Their shrieks echoed through the ruins, not as comfort, but as madness given voice. Those who fled into the underhive fared no better. The ground quaked with every strike, tunnels collapsing into choking clouds of dust and rubble. Generators failed, plunging whole warrens into blackness so complete it felt like drowning. People stumbled blindly, trampling one another, clawing at walls that offered no escape. Gangs who had ruled for decades were erased in moments as ceilings caved, their carved thrones and stolen hoards buried beneath tons of stone. In that absolute dark, the screams never ended, only shifted from one throat to the next as the labyrinth folded in upon itself. From orbit, it was measured, calculated, a ritual as old as the Imperium itself. Each strike plotted, each detonation sanctified by the chanting of tech priests and the cold precision of cogitators. To the crew, It was numbers and targets, efficiency recorded in sacred binary. To those below, it was apocalypse. The difference between priest and victim was perspective. From above, duty. From below, damnation. And when the second wave passed, silence returned again, but it was not the same silence as before. This was heavier, suffocating, broken only by the low groans of the earth and the crackle of endless fires. Survivors crawled from ruins with burned skin and broken bones, staring at a sky they could no longer recognize. It glowed red and black, alive with veins of lightning and smoke, as if the stars themselves had been consumed. The weight of silence crushed them, because in their hearts they knew the fleet had not yet finished. The third wave began without warning. There was no pause of ceremony this time, no brief reprieve to cling to. The silence fractured in an instant as the fleet unleashed its full fury, a storm of firepower beyond any mortal reckoning. Orbital lances stitched across the horizon, carving craters so vast they joined into gulfs, swallowing entire cities in single breaths. The planet's surface rippled like skin beneath a scourge, splitting into canyons that vomited magma in incandescent floods. Oceans boiled. At first it was steam towers of scalding vapor, rising miles into the sky, raining back down as sheets of scalding acid. Then the waters themselves roared, waves colliding with impossible force, smashing into coastlines already fractured by tectonic upheaval. Ports, fleets, and shipyards vanished under tidal walls of fire and salt. Creatures of the deep, ancient leviathans that had slept beneath the abyss, thrashed once before turning belly up, their bodies bursting from the heat before they even reached the surface. The seas became graveyards, choked with vapor and carcasses, stretching into infinity. The land was no kinder. Continents tore like parchment under the strain, fault lines yawning open in titanic scars. Cities perched upon their edges slid whole into the abyss, their spires swallowed by quaking shadows. Great manufactorums, once the pride of imperial industry, were consumed in seconds, their stockpiles detonating in chain reactions that blossomed like suns upon the ground. The air itself turned traitor. Breathing became an agony as toxic ash and burning ozone scoured the lungs. Flames leaped from one ruin to the next without need of fuel, feeding upon the very winds that howled through broken towers. Darkness spread not with nightfall, but with smog-thick, unbroken, pressing down until even fire seemed muted within its grip. The sky was no longer a canvas of stars. It was a dome of iron smoke, lit only by the lightning of orbital fury. There were no soldiers now, no civilians, only survivors, clinging desperately to moments already stolen. Some huddled in ruined shrines, holding one another in silence. Others crawled through the rubble, searching for kin who would never answer. A few still raised their voices in prayer, though their words had twisted into hoarse screams, begging for deliverance that would never come. And always, there was the thunder. Not the thunder of storm, but of war made mechanical and infinite. It rolled endlessly across the world, vibrating through bones, shaking teeth loose, cracking the foundations of every wall. The planet itself groaned like a wounded beast beneath the punishment, its mantle shuddering in protest from orbit. The commanders of the fleet did not waver. Their duty was clear, their orders sanctified. Exterminatus was not cruelty. It was necessity. A single world weighed nothing against the survival of the Imperium. They spoke in calm tones, adjusting trajectories, reciting catechisms of the Omnissiah as the final barrage was prepared. Each strike was another litany, another nail hammered into the coffin of a planet that would soon cease to exist. Below, the last vestiges of hope extinguished. For days, whispers had lingered, rumors of shelters deep enough to endure, or hidden ships that might pierce the blockade. But when the third wave struck, such illusions shattered. No bunker could resist tectonic upheaval. No vessel could outrun oceans of fire. The truth became undeniable. There would be no survival, no remnant, no history left behind. The bombardment reached its crescendo in fire so absolute it rivaled the birth of suns. From space, the planet's surface was a patchwork of glowing scars, each brighter than the last, merging into a single incandescent shroud. From the ground, it was endless horizon aflame, a dawn that burned hotter than any star. Shadows ceased to exist, for there was nowhere left untouched by the light of annihilation. And then, silence again. But this silence was final. No cries, no prayers, no life, only the echo of a world erased. The world that had been teeming with life now lay silent beneath an ash-choked sky. Smoke rose from fissures that ran like jagged scars across the scarred surface, drifting lazily into nothingness. The fires of bombardment still glowed, small but persistent, flickering in the ruins like the last pulse of a dying heart. Among the few who survived, the air was thick, not only with ash, but with disbelief. Faces streaked with soot stared at the horizon, eyes reflecting the glow of destruction, searching for something, anything, that might tell them this was not the end. Priests wandered among the ruins like shadows, their robes torn, their censers empty, swinging nothing but memory and desperation. Their voices cracked as they recited prayers louder than the whispering wind, trying to summon the presence of the Emperor into a world where his mercy had seemingly abandoned them. Some fell to their knees before craters that had once been habblocks, pleading for absolution, as if uttering the names of the dead might bring them back, or at least release them from damnation. Others shook with rage, hurling their censers into the fire, accusing the Emperor of silence, of judgment delivered without cause, of faith betrayed in the midst of the devastation. The survivors found themselves facing the raw, unfiltered reality of their fragility. Soldiers, once proud and disciplined, crawled across the rubble, clutching shards of armor or weapons melted and useless. Some attempted to rally their troops, calling names into the wind, but no answer came. Units had been erased entirely, their standards charred beyond recognition, their banners reduced to ash in the blast winds, without structure, without purpose, without even the faint comfort of hope. They wandered like ghosts. Families were broken beyond repair. Children clung to corpses, unwilling to release the hands of mothers or fathers whose warmth had long since faded. Others cried silently in corners, eyes wide and unblinking, staring at nothing, as though the world itself had vanished and left only empty space behind. Mothers whispered songs that no one could hear, and fathers muttered names of planets and stars they had known, hoping the repetition might keep memory alive, even as the world itself was forgotten. Among the ruins, the people began to question everything they had believed. Faith, once a shield against the horrors of the galaxy, now felt brittle, a fragile shell cracked by fire and devastation. Liturgies fell flat against the enormity of what had occurred. Prayers seemed swallowed before reaching the Emperor, leaving nothing but the echo of their own inadequacy. Temples that had housed the faithful for centuries now lay in ash, their icons melted, their bells silenced. What god, they wondered, could watch this and remain silent? What divine presence would allow the world to burn in perfect obedience to law, yet perfect cruelty? Even the psychers and astropaths who had survived the strike were not untouched. Their visions, once glimpses of the warp's distant eddies, now showed only fire and dust, echoes of suffering that could not be counted. Some went mad, their minds cracking under the weight of the impossible scale of loss. Others fell silent, staring at the horizon, as though waiting for an answer that would never arrive. And yet, even amid despair, some clung stubbornly to faith. Not the blind, comforting faith of before, but something harder, forged in fire, a recognition that survival was neither deserved nor promised, but that remembrance and loyalty were their last weapons. In the rubble, small acts of devotion continued. A priest whispered a litany over a child's body. A soldier placed a charred banner in a makeshift shrine. A mother scattered the ashes of her family into the wind, bowing low in ritual respect. These acts were fragile, almost meaningless in the face of absolute destruction. Yet they carried the faintest echo of defiance, a heartbeat of humanity against the vast silence of annihilation. The ruins themselves seemed to mock them. Every crater, every fissure, every burned-out block bore witness to the scale of the Imperium's judgment. And yet, in that desolation, the survivors moved forward, slowly, painfully, because, in the absence of structure, in the absence of hope, movement itself became an act of rebellion. To walk through the ashes was to assert existence, however brief and diminished, against the certainty of oblivion. The survivors moved like specters, their shadows long and trembling across a landscape that had ceased to belong to them. Streets they had walked daily were now canyons of molten stone and twisted metal, the skeletal remains of hablocks jutting into the smoke-choked sky. Their minds struggled to reconcile the world they remembered with the one that remained. Each step, each breath, carried a reminder. Nothing would be the same. Nothing could ever be the same. And yet they walked forward, compelled by habit, by instinct, or by the faintest hope that anything might endure. Among them, moral codes fractured as readily as the buildings around them. Soldiers scavenged weapons from fallen comrades, not for loyalty or strategy, but survival. Gangs that had lain dormant now hunted with a feral precision, preying on the weak or those too shocked to flee. Even priests, who had once been untouchable pillars of the Emperor's mercy, found themselves torn between guiding the living and protecting their own lives. Faith and morality became fluid, bending under the pressure of absolute catastrophe, revealing the raw human instinct that persisted when all else failed. The children, perhaps the cruelest casualties, carried the weight of what remained. Some mimicked adults, wielding makeshift weapons or scavenged equipment, as if performance could replace knowledge, as if play could stave off terror. Others stared silently, eyes wide and unblinking, clutching charred dolls or the empty hands of parents gone. Their minds yet untouched by comprehension, but already haunted by instinctive fear. They wandered between corpses and ruins, following survivors in uncertain formation, their small presence a fragile tether to continuity. In moments of forced stillness, the survivors questioned the Emperor himself. In whispering tones, they debated whether obedience had ever mattered, whether loyalty had been rewarded or simply recorded and then erased along with their world. A mother cried over her child's ashes, calling upon a god who had not answered, while a veteran, scorched and broken, muttered that the Emperor had sent punishment with no hope of mercy. Faith wavered in these shadows, as did loyalty, as did the fragile cohesion that had bound society together for centuries. Some sought understanding in ruins, examining scorched artifacts, shattered data slates, and fragments of records. In them, they read stories of a planet once alive, of human ingenuity and devotion, of daily toil and the accumulation of memory now vanished. They held fragments to their faces, trying to memorize the shape of life that had been, but even memory seemed incomplete, corrupted by trauma and by the smoke that still clung to lungs and eyes. In this exercise, survivors confronted an impossible question. If the record of existence could vanish so completely, what meaning did life hold at all? Priests and psychically sensitive individuals felt the psychic resonance of the destruction, echoes of suffering and fire lingering in the warp like storm clouds suspended above a shattered landscape. Some screamed, others fell unconscious, and a few, most rare of all, whispered that the Emperor's gaze had passed over them, that they had been spared, not for mercy, but for observation, a record kept in shadowed silence. These whispers spread, gaining traction among those desperate for explanation, though no comfort was found in speculation that mingled rumor with fear. Amid this chaos, small pockets of defiance appeared. A mother shared water with strangers. A veteran guided a child through rubble. A priest raised a tiny flame in remembrance. And in that act, brief clarity emerged. Life persisted, even when all else had been stripped away. Survival was no longer measured in numbers or territory, but in the ability to endure sight and memory, in the capacity to act when reason and hope seemed lost. And so, the survivors walked onward through streets where no shadows remained, through fields where only ash grew, through alleys haunted by the whispers of those who had vanished. Each step carried weight, each breath a testament, each heartbeat a defiance of the silence imposed by fire and judgment. Though faith had been shattered, though morals bent and broke, though the planet itself seemed cursed beyond repair, the remaining few continued, moving through the remnants of the world, unsure if they were living or simply enduring the final cadence of a once vibrant world now consigned to oblivion. Asterisk. As the fires smoldered and ash drifted like snow through broken streets, a strange quiet settled over the remnants of the planet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of comprehension, of those who had survived long enough to see the full measure of destruction and understand that it was final. Survivors moved with deliberate slowness, stepping over the charred remains of what had been, their movements shaped not by urgency, but by the weight of memory and the faint stirrings of reflection. Some paused beside the ruins of temples and shrines, placing hands upon melted statues and blackened altars. They did not pray as before. There was no supplication in their touch, only acknowledgement. They traced the scars of fire with fingers that trembled, whispering names they feared the stars themselves would forget. In these gestures, fragile as spiderwebs, lingered the first indication that even in absolute devastation, the human impulse to bear witness survived. Faith, though fractured, had not entirely vanished. It had been refined to a stubborn ember, one that refused to die, even in the face of total annihilation. Pockets of survivors gathered around each other, sharing the barest necessities, water from boiled debris, scraps of food scavenged from collapsed storerooms, warmth stolen from lingering embers. Conversations were scarce, words stripped down to essential syllables, the burden of trauma compressing language into silence or mutterings. Yet within those hushed exchanges, trust began to form anew, small and fragile, like shoots emerging through cracked concrete. It was not hope in the way children once imagined it, not faith in the way priests once promised it, but a recognition that survival itself was a form of defiance, a quiet resistance against the totality of what had been unleashed. Among the survivors, questions stirred that could not be silenced. Had they truly been abandoned? Or had the Emperor's hand passed over them in judgment, leaving only those necessary to witness, to remember, to carry the truth of obliteration forward into the galaxy? Psychers whispered, of visions glimpsed in the warp, fragments of firestorms, the glow of orbital weapons, fleets moving with solemnity across the void. Some dismissed these as delusion, others believed, feeling the resonance of their survival as both curse and duty. In those moments, spiritual reckoning was not dictated by dogma, but by the raw, unshakable truths of experience. The physical landscape mirrored the internal fracture. Buildings no longer bore the marks of civilization. They were ruins, blackened, twisted, and skeletal. Rivers boiled in places, dried in others, carrying the remnants of life into molten pools. Streets were uneven, carved into jagged patterns by collapsing terrain, a map of destruction writ large across the surface. The survivors navigated this world as if through memory itself, testing each step, learning which paths still bore the weight of human life, and which had been claimed entirely by fire and earth. Yet amid the desolation, small signs persisted that the world had not been reduced to absolute silence. Birds, rare and hesitant, emerged from charred treetops, calling softly to each other in the still air. Insects that had survived the heat crawled over debris, conducting the smallest acts of daily life. Even the wind, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and burnt flesh, seemed to murmur that some essence remained, no matter how fragile. These minuscule phenomena became talismans for the survivors, proof that the planet, though purged, was not entirely dead. As the sun nor what remained of it behind smoke-choked clouds rose over the jagged horizon, the survivors paused together on a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of ruin. They did not cheer. They did not cry. They simply observed. Some lifted eyes skyward, not to plead, but to acknowledge what had passed and what had survived. And in that shared silence, the first faint stirrings of determination took root. They would endure. They would witness. They would carry the memory of what was lost, even as the galaxy beyond awaited its own reckoning. The ember of resilience burned quietly in the hearts of the few, unyielding despite despair, unbroken despite judgment. And from that ember, the path forward began to take shape, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniable. The survivors would move. They would remember. They would endure. From orbit, the planet was a sheet of fire and shadow, a mosaic of annihilation that stretched to the horizon. The fleet moved with deliberate precision, maintaining formations that had been drilled into them over centuries, though the crews knew that discipline mattered little to the dead world below. Observers peered through reinforced viewports, their faces pale behind masks as they recorded data and cataloged destruction. To them, the planet was no longer inhabited. It was a testament, a data point, a world erased in the name of survival and duty. The admirals and fleet commanders spoke sparingly, their words clipped and measured. Exterminatus was routine, ritualized, yet the scale never failed to impress even the most seasoned officers. They recorded the sequence of detonations, the precise collapse of tectonic plates, the burn patterns of atmosphere and surface alike. All of it would be sent to the Adeptus Administratum and the Ordo Xenos, filed under the sacred logs of the Emperor's judgment. And yet, in the private quarters of the captains, there were whispers, rumors of what lay beyond the fleet's sensors, hints that the Emperor's gaze lingered longer on some survivors than on others. Whether this was duty or divine will, none could say with certainty. From the observation decks, psychers and sanctioned diviners felt the echo of death vibrating through the warp. It was a pulse not unlike the heartbeat of a vast creature, though one that had been crushed under impossible weight. Their visions were fragmented, glimpses of firestorms consuming cities, of human screams swallowed by the void, of ash drifting across oceans and mountains alike. Some fell to their knees, muttering prayers to the Emperor. Fearing that their perceptions had drawn them too close to the suffering they were mandated only to observe. Others recorded everything, their trance-like focus a means of keeping the galaxy's memory intact, even when the planet itself would be remembered no more. Even among hardened veterans, the fleet's silence carried a weight. There was no joy in survival, no pride in duty fulfilled. The act of erasure, no matter how necessary, demanded recognition of what had been sacrificed. Ships glided past, orbiting debris and fragments that had been lofted into space by the initial waves of fire. Remnants of cities, manufactorums, and temples suspended in silent testimony. The sight reminded observers of the fragility of all human endeavor, how even centuries of labor, devotion, and faith could be undone in the span of hours by calculated precision and celestial fire. Some captains allowed their gaze to wander further, beyond the planet and the immediate fleet. There were other systems nearby, quiet now, watching, waiting, as if the galaxy itself had absorbed the echoes of destruction and held its breath. They wondered how many other worlds carried secret histories, fragile civilizations, or faith untested by flame. How many planets had survived through chance alone, spared only by the fleet's movement or the imperatives of higher command? These questions lingered in the minds of those who commanded the fleet, unanswerable yet impossible to dismiss. Amid the logistics of observation, reports began arriving from forward outposts. Signals picked up in the void, faint disturbances in the warp, whispers of fragments of life attempting to endure. Some observers dismissed these as anomalies, others as evidence that even judgment could not entirely erase existence. The question haunted the psychers: had some aspect of the planet survived in ways the mortal eye could not perceive? Was it merely debris, or a spark of defiance persisting beyond immediate obliteration? No answer came, only the steady pulse of the void, relentless and impartial. And yet, despite the enormity of the destruction, a subtle awe threaded through the fleet. Not of cruelty, but of scale, of the power entrusted to the Imperium, and of the meticulous care with which the act had been executed. To erase a world without waste, without error, without leaving even a fragment to breed rebellion or corruption, that was the craft of divine instruments, human and machine alike, acting under the Emperor's will. It was efficiency honed to perfection, terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. The dead planet hung in the viewport, glowing faintly where fires persisted, and the crew moved on. Yet, in the deepest thoughts of the witnesses, the echoes of the flames would remain. They would carry the memory into other systems, record it for the Imperium, and ponder the fragility of life, faith, and civilization itself. In the wake of annihilation, the galaxy had grown quieter, smaller, and infinitely heavier with unspoken questions. Even after the bombardment ceased, the fleet remained in orbit, not out of necessity, but out of caution and reverence. The world below had been purged, yet its scars lingered, not only in fire and ash, but in the psychic resonance that hovered above its surface. Psychers in observation chambers shivered as the echoes of human anguish washed over them, a resonance that would take hours, even days, to fully subside. It was as if the planet itself, though dead in flesh, had left a fragment of memory embedded in the warp, a faint, trembling imprint of life extinguished too quickly to be complete. Reports arrived from neighboring systems. Outposts detected subtle disruptions in the void, slight deviations in asteroid paths, and faint bursts of warp energy that defied explanation. Some whispered that fragments of the planet's essence had lingered, carried unknowingly into space by tidal forces, debris, or warp currents. Scholars and sanctioned diviners debated these observations cautiously. None could confirm, none could deny, yet the possibility, however slight, stirred unease. Even in death, it seemed, a world might leave a trace that the galaxy could feel. Among the fleet's commanders, reflection tempered duty. In private chambers, captains and admirals pondered the morality of their actions, not in terms of disobedience, but in terms of inevitability. Exterminatus was never a choice of cruelty. It was a calculation of survival. A single rebellious world could imperil entire sectors, sowing corruption and allowing the forces of chaos to flourish unchecked. Yet the contemplation of what had been erased, a planet's memories, its lives, its faith, was unavoidable. Officers spoke quietly of the weight of witness, of the responsibility to carry the story of a civilization reduced to ash. The spiritual toll was evident among priests and sanctioned psychers aboard the fleet. Some meditated for hours, seeking to reconcile duty with conscience, chanting liturgies that seemed hollow against the scale of loss they had seen. Others performed ritual cleansing, scattering traces of psychic residue into the void, attempting to protect the fleet from contamination by echoes of suffering. Even the most devout among them felt tremors of doubt, not in the Emperor's will, but in their own capacity to comprehend absolute judgment. Beyond the immediate fleet, the destruction sent ripples across nearby star systems. Vessels bound for neighboring worlds slowed or altered course, wary of residual warp disturbances. Merchant convoys reported navigational anomalies. Scouting skimmers detected faint gravitic distortions. In some cases, isolated populations interpreted these signs as omens, preaching that the Emperor's wrath had reached even the stars themselves. Rumors spread quickly through channels, mixing superstition with fact, and in that mixture lay the seeds of both fear and awe. Meanwhile, the dead planet continued to glow faintly in observation feeds. From above, the fires seemed almost alive, shifting and pulsing as if the world itself were breathing its last. Crews watched in silence, some unable to look away, mesmerized by the scale of destruction they had wrought, others praying that the Emperor's mercy had reached whatever remained of the world's essence. They recorded everything, their logics precise, their data unyielding, but behind every report lay the unspoken question: what does it mean to destroy an entire world, and yet carry forward as though nothing has changed? And in that quiet contemplation, small acts of remembrance emerged. Observers sketched maps, catalogued ruins, and annotated psychic impressions, not merely for duty, but to honor the lives that had ended. Some psychers murmured names they had glimpsed in the warp, offering the faintest acknowledgement that existence, even when obliterated, was not entirely meaningless. In these gestures, ritual merged with observation, and the fleet became both executioner and chronicler, balancing duty with the faintest glimmer of conscience. As the fleet prepared to depart, the dead planet receded into the distance, a scar against the black canvas of space. Yet even as sensors registered no remaining life, no signals, no hint of survival, the echoes remained, in the warp, in memory, in the consciousness of those who had witnessed the destruction. And those echoes would travel with the fleet, threading through the galaxy as whispers, reminders, and perhaps warnings. The Imperium had struck with finality, yet nothing in the void could erase the weight of what had been seen, what had been felt, or what would be remembered. As the fleet departed the orbit of the annihilated world, silence settled aboard the command vessels, not the silence of routine, but the kind that weighed heavily in every chamber, every viewport, every instrument console. Even the hum of engines seemed subdued, as if the void itself acknowledged the magnitude of what had passed. The planet receded, its glowing scars fading slowly into memory. Yet none aboard the fleet could truly forget the scale of the devastation, nor the fragile remnants of life they had glimpsed clinging to the ruins. The psychers and diviners spoke little, but their eyes betrayed the lingering resonance of the warp. Some whispered of strange impressions, flickers of consciousness, half-formed shapes in the psychic currents, remnants of memories that should have been extinguished. Were they illusions, echoes of trauma, or evidence that even absolute fire could not erase every trace of existence? The debate was unending, and no certainty could be found. Such questions, though unanswerable, gnawed at the edges of every observer's mind, reminding them that the Imperium's reach was absolute, but not omnipotent. Fleet commanders, usually immune to reflection in the crucible of duty, felt a subtle unease. They had executed the Emperor's judgment with precision, yet in their private quarters, moments of contemplation lingered. Could the galaxy truly be measured in absolutes? Was duty solely the calculation of survival, or did it carry a weight that could not be quantified? They catalogued every detail, yet the human element the lives erased. The faith destroyed, the echoes in the warp remained unquantifiable. Observation records were complete. Conscience was not. Meanwhile, signals from distant systems began to filter in. Nearby sectors, sensing the sudden absence of the destroyed world's gravitational and political influence, reacted with a mixture of awe, fear, and opportunism. Minor rebellions, long suppressed, flickered in the outer rim of adjacent systems, small sparks of disorder taking advantage of the vacuum. Star charts were adjusted, patrols reassigned, and intelligence nodes activated. The galaxy responded not only to destruction itself, but to the perception of power the Emperor's will radiating outward, a force felt in mind and spirit as much as in physical reality. Yet, amid these movements, a subtle philosophical thread emerged. Scholars aboard the fleet, monks of logic and faith, began to speak quietly of balance, of necessity, and of the terrible beauty of absolute judgment. They pondered the relationship between creation and destruction, survival and sacrifice, memory and oblivion. The dead planet had become a lens through which to understand the fragility of life in the Imperium, the responsibility of those who wielded the Emperor's instruments, and the unseen consequences that rippled outward into systems yet untouched by war. Even as the fleet charted a new course, the psychic echoes of the destroyed world lingered. Some believed that fragments of consciousness persisted, whispering faintly through the warp, offering testimony to the lives extinguished. Others argued that such whispers were danger itself, a contamination that might inspire chaos, mutation, or heresy in ways undetectable by standard observation. The line between memory and hazard blurred, leaving every observer aware that death was never truly final in the galaxy. Some forces endured beyond flesh, beyond stone, beyond the burning sky. In the fleet's wake, the universe itself seemed subtly altered. Space was quieter in some corridors, resonant with absence. Time itself, measured through logs and astropaths, felt heavier, and in the hearts of those who had borne witness, a cautious reverence took root. Destruction was necessary, but memory mattered, and even the Imperium's instruments were imperfect in their understanding of what endured. In this recognition lay both humility and forewarning. The galaxy was vast, its dangers countless, and the consequences of even absolute judgment could ripple unpredictably through time and space. As the last of the orbital flares faded into distant memory, and the dead world became just another point in the void, the fleet pressed onward. Yet, behind every sensor reading, every log entry, every recorded observation, the echoes of flame persisted. They would remain in the psyches of those who had witnessed them, in the warp that hummed with memory, and perhaps, faintly, in the galaxy itself. The Imperium had acted, the world had been erased, and yet the story of what had been and what might linger beyond comprehension was far from concluded. Beyond the void where light itself seemed hesitant, the echoes of the annihilated world lingered, not in flesh, not in stone, but in memory and in the warp. A subtle pulse threaded through space like a faint heartbeat, almost imperceptible yet undeniable to those trained to perceive it. Psychers aboard distant vessels, sensitive even at hundreds of light, whispered of traces that seemed neither alive nor entirely gone, ghosts of a civilization, fragments of experience, lingering beyond the capacity of death to erase. In the Imperium, such phenomena were always treated with caution, for every spark of existence left behind might also carry risk. Mutation, temptation, or heresy could grow from memory itself. Rumors began to circulate among scholars and tech priests who monitored distant systems. They spoke in hushed tones of the dead world's essence, persisting in strange pockets of the warp, fragments that sang faintly with the rhythm of life once lived. Some considered it evidence of the Emperor's subtle mercy, a recognition that the galaxy's story must be preserved even in obliteration. Others argued it was a hazard, a lingering psychic anomaly that could ripple through fleets, systems, and even planetary minds, stirring unrest or inspiring fanatic devotion in ways that could not be measured. The Astronomicon pulsed faintly as the fleet moved beyond the former planet's system. Its light, a beacon through the darkness, seemed steadier, brighter, and yet somehow heavier, weighted with the memory of what had been erased. Some whispered that the Emperor himself had noted the survival of certain fragments, not in a gesture of favor, but in the cosmic bookkeeping of existence, a ledger of lives, deeds, and failures too intricate for mortal comprehension. Whether mercy, observation, or calculation, none could say. What was certain was that even the flames of annihilation did not nullify the universe's capacity to remember. In isolated sectors, far from observation, monks and scholars debated the nature of memory itself. Was existence solely in the body, or could consciousness, action, and faith leave imprints across space and time? If fragments of a world persisted in the warp, could they communicate, learn, or even influence the living? The discourse was speculative, bordering on heretical in some circles, yet necessary. The galaxy had learned that death was not always absolute, and in that knowledge lay both hope and dread. The surviving psychers aboard the fleet spoke cautiously of resonance patterns that hinted at faint cohesion among these fragments. The patterns were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested something more than chaos. Echoes of purpose, remnants of loyalty or devotion that had survived the purge. Some suggested that, in the warp, memory became a kind of architecture, a lattice of experience that could endure when flesh and stone failed. Others cautioned that these fragments might also attract attention, drawing the gaze of forces beyond comprehension, demons, xenos, or phenomena not yet catalogued by the Imperium. Philosophers aboard the fleet considered the cosmic significance. Every Exterminatus, they reasoned, was both a closure and a seed. Worlds ended, yet their stories persisted in fragmentary ways. Systems adjusted, fleets recorded, psychers sensed. The galaxy did not forget, and while mortal life could be extinguished, the essence of existence, the choices, the faith, the fear, the suffering, code outward, threading through time and space in subtle yet undeniable ways, and in the parts of those who had witnessed the destruction firsthand. The memory remained, sharpened by observation and experience. They understood that their duty extended beyond immediate survival or mission logs. They were carriers of testimony, observers of annihilation, witnesses to the fragility and persistence of life. In some quiet moment, in the meditation of a psyker, the calculation of a captain, or the prayer of a priest, the universe seemed to lean closer, as though listening to the stories left behind by a world erased. From the perspective of the fleet moving ever outward, the galaxy was a place of infinite peril and infinitesimal mercy. Worlds could vanish, civilizations could be extinguished, yet the essence of existence was rarely lost. Every act of destruction created ripples. Every life extinguished left a whisper. And in that whisper, in that subtle resonance, the universe remembered. The Emperor's hand was precise, absolute. And yet even he could not erase the traces of memory entirely. The fleet continued its course through the stars, and behind them, the ember of the dead world glowed faintly, a reminder that annihilation is never total, and that, even in the cold vastness of space, fragments of eternity endure. The galaxy moves onward, forever shaped by acts of judgment. The choices of mortals and immortals alike, and the faint, persistent memory of worlds that once were. The fleet pressed onward, leaving the charred remnants of the world behind, yet the weight of what had been destroyed followed them like a shadow. In the silence of the void, each crew member carried the images of fire and ash, the echo of shattered lives, the faint hum of existence that refused to die. Even machinery seemed subdued, as if recognizing that the instruments of judgment had done more than they were built to do. They had witnessed, and witnesses, whether flesh, metal, or mind, remember in ways that are impossible to erase. Philosophers and psychers aboard the fleet spoke of resonance not as abstract theory, but as a tangible thread connecting the living, the dead, and the spaces between. Perhaps, they suggested, the universe itself kept record, a ledger not of law or order, but of experience. Every moment of faith, fear, and defiance was etched somewhere, imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet indelible. Even a world erased in flame left traces, subtle and persistent, a memory carried across light. These were fragments of eternity, small and nearly invisible, yet unyielding. Rumors spread among distant sectors, carried by astropaths and void-born travelers, whispers of anomalies, of faint psychic signals that defied explanation. Some believed these were the remnants of the destroyed world, clinging to existence in the warp, seeking acknowledgement, seeking voice. Others feared that the traces were dangerous, a lure for forces the Imperium could neither name nor control. And always, beneath speculation and fear, ran a subtle reverence in understanding that even in death, life leaves a mark, that annihilation is never truly absolute, and that the cosmos has memory as relentless as it is impartial. Among the fleet's observers, personal reflection deepened. Captains, who had issued orders, now contemplated the moral weight of their actions. Officers who had catalogued destruction began to record not only data, but impressions, prayers, and conjectures. Every report, every log, became layered with subtle acknowledgement. The lives lost, the faith broken, the worlds erased. They did not rejoice. They did not celebrate. They bore witness. And in bearing witness, they became more than executors of duty. They became keepers of memory, custodians of fragments that the galaxy itself might forget, if not for their vigilance. The Astronomicon pulsed faintly through the darkness, a reminder of the Emperor's light, of guidance that persisted across impossible distances. It was steady, unwavering, yet somehow heavier with the burden of the erased world. Perhaps, whispered the fleet's psychers, even the Emperor himself acknowledged the persistence of memory, not as mercy, but as inevitability. Existence, once touched by life, leaves a ripple too complex to extinguish entirely. The galaxy carries these ripples in silence, in stars, in the warp, and in the minds of those who observe as they moved further from the system. The fleet sensors recorded nothing left on the planet, no signals, no life, no movement. And yet the psychers, the scholars, and the officers all knew that absence was not final. The fragments remained, whispering faintly through the warp, waiting, remembered by the very act of observation. Even in absolute destruction, the galaxy retains memory. Even in obliteration, life leaves trace. Even in silence, there is resonance. And so the fleet continued, bearing with it the weight of judgment and the knowledge of persistence. The galaxy stretched vast and unknowable, full of dangers, full of wonders, and threaded with the echoes of countless worlds that had endured, perished, or lingered in the spaces between. Every act of destruction, every fragment of survival, became part of a grand tapestry, one woven from fire, memory, faith, and the unyielding will of the Emperor. The dead planet became a distant point of light, no longer burning, yet never entirely absent. Its story remained in the records, in the whispers of psychers, in the reflections of observers, and in the quiet understanding that even in the most absolute judgment, existence is rarely, if ever, erased. In the endless night of the void, fragments endure, carrying with them the echo of eternity itself. The galaxy moved onward, vast and indifferent, yet filled with the memory of worlds lost and the persistence of life that refused to be fully forgotten. And somewhere in that infinite expanse, the ember of a vanished world continued to whisper its story, a faint pulse that would resonate across stars and centuries, a reminder that annihilation is never truly complete, and that the universe, in its quiet, unyielding way, remembers all. Asterisk.